Hey there, Scott here from SocialNRG Presents, and thanks once again for joining us. This episode is particularly exciting for us as we feature a true music heavyweight, a 4-time Juno Award winner, Mr. Jim Vallance, a prolific songwriter, arranger, and producer. Jim is perhaps best known as a songwriting partner for their international music icon, Bryan Adams, with whom he co-wrote such hits as Cuts Like a Knife, Heaven, and The Summer of '69, just to name a few. Jim has also co-written a long list of hit songs with many other artists, including Aerosmith, Rod Stewart, Roger Daltrey, Tina Turner, Alice Cooper, Ozzy Osbourne, Kiss, and the Scorpions. For his extensive body of work, Jim has received numerous industry awards, including Composer of the Year, a record 4 times. He's also a member of the Order of Canada. And today, Jim joins us from his home in New York City to talk about his exciting career and bring us up to speed on what he's working on next. So sit back, relax, and get ready as SocialNRG now presents you with your Backstage Pass. How are you, Jim?
I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Jim, I finally get a chance to talk to you properly because Jim and I have conferred over the phone and emails. Like, we email each other a fair amount anyway. But the past few times I've been talking to you, I've been going, I don't want to talk to you now because I want to save it for the show. So, because there's so many things we just get off and ramble about stuff all the time because we're just total Beatle freaks. So we're always trading things back and forth on that. So. Except you actually got to do a lot of stuff that I can't wait to talk to you about. You actually got to live some of that stuff, which is great, and continue to do that.
Life's a gift, Mick.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. But can we, before we get into your incredible career, can we go back a bit? Because now you were born in northern BC, is that correct?
No, Chilliwack, actually.
You were born in Chilliwack. Oh,
yeah. But my dad was a small town bank manager. And they got moved every 2 years. I didn't realize until years and years later, the reason they moved them every 2 years was that so no manager could stay in place long enough to commit fraud. So they would actually move a manager every 2 years and move an assistant manager every other 2 years. So there was always an overlap at every small branch. I don't know if that was based on some history of fraud, but anyway, long story short, my entire life from the day I was born until I graduated high school and moved away, we moved every 2 years. So it was Chilliwack, Abbotsford, North Vancouver, Kamloops, Vanderhoof, Terrace, Cranbrook. Don't think I've missed anything, but it was small towns all over BC.
Wow. So what bank did you work for, by the way?
Royal Bank.
It was Royal Bank. Yeah. I had no idea they did things like that, but it kind of makes sense, I suppose. But
yeah, I mean, again, I didn't find out the reason until just a couple of years ago. But it was disruptive. I mean, imagine you're in grade 6. You've made a group of friends, and I'm not talking end of grade 6. I'm talking like maybe February, halfway through the school year. They just uproot you, move you to a new town, drop you into a new classroom of kids that you never met, and you make friends quick at that age. But it's disruptive, and it's not great for family life, and certainly not for lasting friendships and that sort of thing.
Well, that's another question. Like, where do you figure you were like a lonely kid?
I think it had some influence on who I am, and I mean, it affects you. Yeah. So. I mean, I'm still in touch with various friends from along the way, believe it or not. I mean, the various schools and even as far back as elementary school, I still correspond occasionally with a few friends. So, I did make friends, and there were lasting relationships. But, the uprooting part of it, and reading about creative people like, Jim Morrison, who was an army brat, and John Lennon, whose life, home life was kind of disrupted.
Annie Nancy Wilson, army brats.
Yeah. So there's a lot of family disruption, I find, amongst creative people. I don't know if you've, in your experience or your research, that's been the case.
Well, Bryan too. Bryan Adams.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bryan's father was a diplomat. They moved from Portugal to Israel to, back to Canada eventually. Yeah. So I haven't done any, thorough research on the subject, but I do believe it kind of messes you messes you up just enough to kind of trigger some kind of creative gene.
Well, you would think it would make you more internal, and sort of get into your own sort of mind, because that's all you have to rely on. Because a lot of kids, their whole life is centered around their friends and what they're doing. You don't have that luxury when you're constantly being taken away from those friends,
Yeah, and I sort of just went along with it. That it was just how our family rolled, and it didn't really affect me until, remember the very last move. That was the toughest one. That was February in grade 12. So in other words, I started with a whole new school, whole new town, whole new group of classmates in
So
February.
from what town? So for what was that one? From what town to what town?
That was Terrace to Cranbrook.
Wow.
So I graduated high school with a group of people that I had virtually just met.
Wow.
So, and that was tough. I remember that was the tough one. That was the real tough one. Then after that, I was off to university and adult life. So
you went to UBC?
Just for 1 year, I did music school. And I mean, there's a whole little side story there where, all through school, the first thing I did, I remember moving from, let me think, where was it? Vanderhoof to Terrace in grade 9. And I remember the first day of school, I don't remember what month, but it was the middle of grade 9, like February or March or something. And the first thing I did on the first day in school was ask around any musicians, in my class. And there was one, and we kind of hit it off. And long story short, ended up forming a band and went with another fellow. But that was sort of the first connection I would try and do, is find other like-minded kids. And
well, you're a multi-instrumentalist, but what was your first instrument?
I took piano lessons when I was 7 or 8. I didn't enjoy it, but in retrospect, I'm glad I did it, because it implanted some skills and discipline. And then I really didn't enjoy it, and so I quit when I was 9 or 10 or something. Just begged my mother, please, I don't want to do this anymore. It just wasn't fun, and it was, I think back on the teachers, they didn't make it fun either. They were pretty strict and serious about music. And I think even they forgot that it's fun. You don't work the piano, you play the piano. It's supposed to be fun. Yeah. Anyway, I quit lessons. And then music was not on my radar at all. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I was like into Major League Baseball. Back in those days, it was Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra and Roger Maris, and, a lot to be really excited about. And I followed the New York Yankees. And comic books, Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, the DC comics. I was totally into that. And then, as you will know, watching TV one night randomly, one Sunday night, and it's like, ladies and gentlemen, from Liverpool, the Beatles. And I was like, the what? And I'm just sitting there. I'm sure if a camera had been rolling, my jaw would have dropped and my eyes would have was like, what is, and I knew at that instant, I knew that was it. That's what I wanted to do.
It's such an amazing thing. I've talked to Jeff Neal about this, actually, where I've often said I feel sorry for the Beatles. And the reason I feel sorry for them is, like, guys like me and you from different places in life, and almost everybody I've ever met has a story about February 9th, 1964. Yeah. And we all have something that we can talk about where we all felt the same thing, except for those 4 people. All they had was each other. And now there's only 2 left,
Yeah.
They don't have that same experience as the rest of the world.
I was only a month old.
It's the kind of thing, and I don't mean, it's not that you can't go back. I mean, and revisit, and obviously any music fan knows and loves the Beatles, even if you weren't there, when they first arrived on our shores. But it was like Martians had landed. It was life altering, like nothing we'd ever seen. Well,
I always thought that I was 7 when I saw them first, but I just realized 2 days ago I was 6. I was 6 when I saw them. Okay. Yeah. And of course, because my parents were commenting on all these long hairs and all that screaming, and so I was siding with my parents. However, my older brothers and sister, I had one sister that's still left at home. And they were going, this is great. But by the time I now realize that, the timeline was sketchy at that age, but being a Beatle researcher, as we all are to some degree, from Ed Sullivan's show in New York, the next week there were Ed Sullivan's show on the road in Miami. And so they were on the next Sunday. By the next Sunday, I couldn't wait to see them. I was sold right there. Bang.
Yeah. And the Sunday after that, there was 3 in a row.
It was?
There were 3 in a row, yeah.
Oh, what was the one after that?
New York, Miami, and maybe New York. I'm not sure.
New York. Well, yeah. That's right, because there was that famous thing where Epstein gave them to Ed Sullivan for such a cheap price for all 3 shows.
Oh, free. So yeah. Ed Sullivan offered Epstein $10,000, I think a show, I'm not sure which. And Epstein said, we'll do it for free, but we have to open and close every show.
Wow.
So they opened, they played whatever it was, 3 songs set at the beginning of Sullivan on February 9, and then 2 or 3 songs at the end of the show. So they opened and closed, and that was Epstein's deal. And for $0, they did it for free, but on their terms.
What a coup. There's a lot of criticism on how he handled certain things because while it was so new, I mean, all these Beatle wigs and Beatle boots and all this stuff, they just let those licenses go, which to a certain degree, that's why there's so much Beatle fascination to this day, because there's so many people that can still make money off it that aren't paying royalties.
Well, yeah, Epstein sold the merchandising to a guy, if I remember, Sid Bernstein for $100,000. But you have to remember, so this is February 64, and then into March, April, May. And then they did the film A Hard Day's Night with Universal Pictures and, United Artists. And they filmed I think they filmed it in July, and it was a real rush. They wanted to get it out by August because they thought when the kids go back to school in September, the Beatles are done. So let's rush this out. So I'm sure Epstein was thinking, maybe more optimistic than that, but that maybe this is going to all be over. Like 64 is going to be our year, and then that'll be the end of it. So $100,000 for the merchandising must have seemed like a good idea at the time. But then Sid Bernstein went on to make millions and millions.
My sister brought me to the movies when I was very young, obviously, for Hard Day's Night, her and her girlfriend. And all I remember from watching A Hard Day's Night in that theater, I mean, of course, I was a Beatle lover, but every time they appeared on the screen, the girls in the theater would scream. Yeah. Like you couldn't hear the movie because the girls in the theater were screaming. They're screaming at a film. It was just the most incredible thing.
What a phenomenon. It really was.
Absolutely. And the thing is, we still talk about it to this day. Michael Sicoli, good friend of yours and I's, I mean, he keeps saying, he says, it just keeps perpetuating itself, doesn't it, Mick? Like he phoned me 2 days ago. He says, hey, I just found this thing that George did, but we're still doing it after all these years, It's such a fascination.
Yeah, lifelong, really.
Unbelievable. And you were talking about lessons and how boring they are. My family, I come from 7 children. I'm the baby of 7 children. The only person in my family that didn't get music lessons, I'm the only one that made a career out of it. So there's something about these lessons where they're teaching you 3 blind mice when you'd rather be playing something that you like,
Yeah. Well, just to finish the answer to your original question, which I sort of got sidetracked on. So piano lessons, then I quit, and then the Beatles came along. So I was 11 when I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And I begged for the next 2 years for a drum kit. And it took 2 years. When I was 13, finally my grandmother bought me a used kit, a Ludwig kit and she bought it for me in 65. And
wow.
I think it was a late 50s used kit. A friend of hers, I think the son used to play and gave it up. So I got the kit. And then right around the same time, my parents also bought me a guitar for Christmas. So in terms of self-teaching, guitar and drums appeared around the same time.
And you're like Ringo. You're left-handed, but you play a right-handed kit.
Actually, no, I'm right-handed.
What?
Yeah, I play guitar left-handed.
Okay, that's the new one.
Because I wanted to be Paul.
Are you kidding me?
Oh, wow.
I'm not kidding you.
Wow.
Oh, my God.
So remember, I mean, again, back in 64, Beatles on Ed Sullivan Sunday night, and Monday, everyone's picking up a tennis racket or a broom, and I just picked it up, even though I'm right-handed, I picked it up that way. I can't remember if it was a tennis racket or a broom, but, because Paul played that way, and I wanted to be Oh, so by the time I got a real guitar 2 years later, I picked it up that way, and I went, strings are upside down. So I just turned the strings around, and so I'm right-handed, but I play guitar left-handed.
Isn't that amazing? Because that sort of spoils my next question in a way, but maybe not. Because I've often thought there's left-handed guitars, there's left-handed drums, there's left-handed all this. There's no left-handed keyboards. I mean, like, so I've often wondered, like, does a person playing piano, I think I brought this up before somewhere, does the person that plays piano, like a guy like Paul McCartney, does he automatically have a better left hand than a right hand? Because most of us have a better right hand to start with, you know?
Interesting question. But I mean, if you've ever driven a rental car in England, a stick shift, you know, you're suddenly shifting with your left hand, and you think, whoa, that's going to be tough or impossible. You get used to it real quick.
Right.
So I think, I mean, I think back on the people I've worked with, John Wetton from Asia, you know, remember?
Yep.
And King Crimson. He was left-handed but played bass right-handed. And Ringo's left-handed but played drums right-handed. So I mean, and Hendrix was left-handed and played guitar left-handed. So I think anything, whatever works, you know.
Well, there's a few guys that, you know, like, well, one of them is what's his name, the surf kid, Dick Dale, you know, where he's got a right-handed guitar strung right-handed, but he plays it left-handed, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of those guys too, where they're playing all the chords upside down.
Yeah, Buddy Guy, maybe. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. I went to school with a guy like that, actually. And then, of course, Jeff Neal. I mean, we went to school together.
Funny. Yeah, Jeff's left. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to move the camera, but I realized it'd be too much. But because I actually got a Ringo kit. I bought the Black Oyster Pearl. I've got the kit. It's sitting right here. So I've always got them mic'd up just in case I want to do a track, right? So, and I just love them because it took me a long time to get them. So, but it's a 5-piece kit. But it's the same.
I saw his Ed Sullivan kit like in the flesh last year at the Met Museum in New York.
Wow.
They had a rock music set up there. They had Jimmy Page's Les Paul and Keith Richards' guitar, and they had Ringo's Ed Sullivan kit, John's Rickenbacker, one of George's early Hamburg, I think, guitars. I can't remember what they had for Paul. Not anything I can remember, but Ringo's kit, except for the bass drum head with the Beatles on it. There were only 2 of those ever created, and they're both in private collectors' hands.
I've got the stencil. I bought it from some company out of Montreal, I think. So I've got the stencil, and I've yet to put it on my drum head. For one thing, I've got the hole in the bottom for the mic. You know, it sort of takes away from the magic of it, I think. But it's sitting up in the closet behind me. It's interesting you brought that up about the museum. When I was doing a little tour in New Zealand back a few years ago, the guy who brought us over there, his wife, it was his birthday. A very wealthy man, but his wife wanted to buy him a guitar for his birthday. And so she asked me to go to this guitar store to help pick out a guitar. I think we got him a Taylor or a Gibson. I can't remember what it was. It was a fairly decent guitar anyway. And so I start talking to the guy at the shop, of course, about the Beatles, right? And he goes, says, you want to see something? I said, sure. So he brings me upstairs. He's got a complete stage setup, and there's the Beatles gear. And I went, oh my God, that looks totally real. He says, it is. I went, what are you talking about? He says, when they toured Australia and New Zealand, it was they just left the equipment here because it was cheaper to leave it there than to bring it back to England. So they actually had multiple. So it was actually their gear. There was even like a little Farfisa or Vox organ, Vox Continental, the whole thing. It was the whole rig.
That's amazing.
It's unbelievable. So so this guy's got the whole setup and it's upstairs in his store.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really cool. But yeah, so anyway, okay, let's get back. So it's so easy to get lost in this stuff with us. When we get, so you went to UBC for a year. Now, is that when you started? When I say UBC, by the way, for our audience, I should say it's University of British Columbia. You went to UBC. Now, when did the band Sunshine start? Was that around that time?
Well, I went to UBC 1970, 71. Took a year of music. And back in those days, there weren't the options like there are now for jazz school, pop school, that sort of thing. It was classical, end of story. So that's kind of what I had. And it was, I learned stuff. It was intense. But after a year, I realized it wasn't really what I wanted to do in terms of music study.
Excuse me for interrupting, but what was your major instrument for that?
Flute, actually. So you had to take two instruments. So I took piano and flute.
Okay.
And I chose flute because I was a Jethro Tull fan.
Jeff Neal plays flute. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, Jeff plays flute, but he's I don't know why he doesn't play it now, because he was really quite good and he could do all that Jethro Tull sort of blowing.
Yeah.
So
that was my thought. So flute and piano, and then later on I studied cello, but that's another story. So I did a year of UBC, and it just didn't really light my fire. So I took a year off and went traveling. And I came back in '73, and a friend of mine, a sax player, Tom Kinside, rang me up and said, "We're putting a band together. Do you want to join?" I went, "Yeah, sure." So I went and auditioned and got the gig, and that was Sunshine. So that was Tom Kinside, David Sinclair on guitar, Bruce Fairburn on trumpet, Tom Kinside, as I mentioned, on saxophone, Ralph Eppel on trombone, Richard Christie on bass, Peter Baring on piano, and me on drums. And it was a sort of jazz fusion. We did, a bit of Chicago, a bit of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and then some of our own songs that were more jazz rock fusion influenced.
I didn't realize Peter Baring was in that band too, because it's amazing how many people in that band are just legendary people. I mean, like Kenley Side, Bruce Fairburn, Peter Baring. I mean, he's an incredible arranger.
He's an incredible piano player, arranger, writer. Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, and I was by far, and I don't say this to be falsely humble, I was by far the least talented guy in the band. I mean, I had to really scramble to catch up. These guys were so good.
Yeah, unbelievable. So by that time, was drums your main instrument, do you figure, at that point?
Well, pretty much, yeah. So I had, right around the same time, I started to do a bit of session work too, radio commercials and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I always played guitar, and then I picked up piano again, with having, acquired some skills when I was younger. So I was, not by any stretch virtuosic, but I was, competent on piano, guitar, bass, but drums was the instrument I was most comfortable on.
Wow!
So I guess I was essentially a drummer for most.
Well, I've been able to play with you a few times on the kit when you're on the kit, and it's certainly a magical experience. You definitely have that groove. You're definitely right in that pocket all the time. You keep me humble, that's for sure. I was going to say, so the Bruce Fairburn connection would have been made back in those days, I suppose. Yeah. So Bruce and I spent a year together in that band, and then stayed in touch. And I mean, it's a whole longer story. For those that don't know, Bruce went on to produce AC/DC and Aerosmith and Bon Jovi. And so, and Bruce brought me into, the Aerosmith project and a few other things along the way. So my connection with Bruce was very helpful going forward. Right. And, but your first major project together he produced. Now, did you co-produce the first Prism album? Because you were the principal songwriter. We
kind of started off co-producing the first couple of songs that ended up being on the album. We started off co-producing, but it was kind of a too many chefs in the kitchen kind of a setup. So I kind of took a step back and concentrated more on writing the songs, and Bruce took over the production duties. And he was clearly, as was proven later in his career, very qualified and organized, and the perfect guy to just keep things on time, on budget, and draw the best out of the artist. So
I gotta talk to you about this because when you guys you started writing, but I'm trying to figure out, like, Ron Tabak was in a band called Stanley Steamer. Stanley
Steamer, yeah.
Yeah, and now, did you discover him? Were you part of that at all, or did you discover him? Did you sort of discover him for the Prism project? How did that work? Because he's one of Canada's greatest singers. He truly is. Yeah.
So we went, before we even met Ron or even knew about Ron, we went in the studio, into Mushroom Studios, to start recording the first Prism album, and the guitarist Lindsay Mitchell was the designated lead singer. So Lindsay, I think we got as far as cutting 2 tracks with Lindsay singing lead vocals. And it was actually Lindsay himself who came to Bruce and I and said, you know what, I'm not comfortable being the guy. Like, I'm really comfortable being the lead guitar player, but I'm just not feeling it as the lead singer. He said, but I know this kid in New Westminster, or at least he saw Ron playing in a band in New Westminster, which I'm guessing might have been Stanley Screamer.
Maybe it was Stanley, or it was either Stanley Steamer, or Stanley Screamer. It's one of those names.
Stanley Screamer, because Stanley Steamer was the name of an early automobile, steam-powered automobile.
Okay, so
I think
that was the play on. That was the play on words. Okay.
Play on words, yeah, Stanley Screamer. So Lindsay said, "Trust me, this kid's great." So anyway, he brings Ron back into the studio one day, and we have the tracks already recorded. So we just set Ron up with a mic, and he had the opportunity to learn the songs at home, and he came in and sang a couple of songs in the studio and just killed it. I mean, it was like, love at first listen. So we hired him on the spot. So that's how he became the singer.
And what's your okay, so when you who was actually in the original Prism band? Because Tom Lavin from Powder Blues was part of it at one point. Is that true?
There actually was no band.
Okay.
So I mean, literally, Bruce and I had 7 out of the 9 songs, and then Lindsay Mitchell, if I recall, wrote a song, and Tom Lavin wrote a song. But there wasn't a band. It was me and Bruce Fairbairn. Lindsay Mitchell was sort of a constant. He was the lead guitarist. But we brought in 3 different bass players on the album: Richard Christie, Steve Pugsley, and Tom Lavin's brother, Jack.
Okay.
Guitar-wise, Lindsay played most of the guitars, but David St. Clair came in and played some. Keyboards, Peter Bering, Dave Bickel, and Graham Coleman.
Wow.
Drums, I played most of the drums, but I think Dave Calder, who was in Sunshine before me, I think played on at least 1 or 2 tracks. So it really wasn't a band. So the band that finally went out on the road, the first sort of Prism tour where we opened for Foreigner and Heart, that band was me, Tom Lavin, Tom Kinley-Side, Ralph Eppold, Bruce Fairbairn, Lindsay Mitchell, and who was on bass? Richard Christie.
So,
and even that band, and funny enough, in the photo on the album cover, the first Prism album cover, the band that's in the photo, which is John Hall and Ab Bryant. To my recollection, neither of them played a note on the first album.
What? Now, that's my next question. When did Bruce Allen become involved in the management? Was he involved before you guys went into the studio, or once you had the demos together? A
bit of both. I mean, he managed Sunshine, as I recall, and had a long history with Bruce Fairbairn and others. So, yeah, so Bruce was involved probably before we even finished the album. I don't recall exactly, but yeah, he came on pretty soon. It was an obvious choice. I mean, he was like our local, most competent, connected manager guy.
And of course, the signature song that came out of that album was Spaceship Superstar.
It was.
So tell me a bit, like, before we proceed, I want to say that you had a website that was a must-see for every fledgling songwriter and every professional songwriter out there. Sadly, I know you've got to upgrade it. We talked about that because it not only does it show all the songs you've written, you actually were candid enough to show where you got the ideas to make the songs and showing all the demos of the songs in there as they were coming up. It was like one of the most fascinating websites I'd ever been to in my life.
Well, thank you.
It must have taken it
still there.
It's just time.
It's still there, but some of the audio isn't available anymore. I mean, it was a homemade website, and unfortunately, the software is no longer compatible with, as Mac operating systems advanced, the software kind of was obsolete, and I haven't had the time to update the software. It's not just updating, it's actually learning some new stuff. So anyway, it's long overdue to be updated, but it is still there. And what I was sort of trying to do, the magicians, Penn and Teller. I mean, they'll show you how they do their magic, which is kind of cool. So I wanted to reveal, first of all, there are very few completely original ideas. So in other words, most of what I've written has been not stolen and sometimes not even borrowed, but certainly
pay tribute
influenced.
to. Pay tribute to.
Yeah. So you I mean, even listening to early songs I wrote when I was like 14 and 15, I mean, they're almost embarrassingly plagiaristic. I mean, just lifting stuff verbatim from other songs, and then you learn obviously not to do that, to keep the influence but not the content. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in trouble. But everything comes from somewhere.
Well, one of the old songwriting tricks that people talk about is you take a song that you really like, and then change the words, write your own words to it, then change the melody of those chords, and then change the chorus. You got a brand new song.
Yeah.
If you do it step by step, you actually take a hit song and you can almost, if you're lucky, it'll become a big song for yourself. But
I haven't tried that, but thanks for the tip.
So the reason I talked about your website, because how since Spaceship Superstar was such a huge monstrous hit and really did launch you as a writer and producer and everything else.
Success, yeah.
And so what was the impetus? I remember going in your basement when you still lived up in West Vancouver. I think I was there for rehearsal or something. And I remember looking at this old Roland EP1 keyboard, I think it was called. And I went, oh my God, I haven't seen one of those in years. And you went, yeah, that's the Spaceship Superstar keyboard. I went, what? That piece of crap? Because I used to think of it as a piano. You thought of it as a synthesizer. You put it through a flanger or a chorus pedal, whatever, and it becomes this, it sounded like a multi-timbral synth before they even made them.
Before there were even synthesizers,
Yeah. So I just want to know where the idea came for that song. Can you explain a bit of that?
Well, I mean, again, let's talk about influences, because I all but lifted the idea. So it's an eighth note, dun, 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 dun. So, clearly, and this will make sense as soon as I say it, if you listen to, Who's Next, like Won't Get Fooled Again or Bob O'Reilly, that great Pete Townsend is doing a sequenced organ sound, eighth note pattern, again, way before synthesizers, but that's the
like some sort of oscillator or something.
I'm not quite sure how he did it. It might be an oscillator, but what's great is to go online and hear Pete Townsend's home demos for those songs. And he did literally go in the studio verbatim with his organ loop and took that in, and the band just played to it. But when you listen to his home demos, it's pretty cool. So as I recall, I was definitely channeling a bit of that. And then I was also, at the time, really into Kraftwerk, the German
Autobahn.
Autobahn, which is also very eighth note keyboard based. And that was an early synthesizer recording. Back in the days when synthesizers were, a whole wall of gear with all the
it looked like a huge switchboard operator situation. Yeah.
So Spaceship Superstar, a little bit of The Who, a little bit of Kraftwerk, and then when we get to the chorus, the guitar, gang, 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 that's sort of lifted or borrowed or inspired by Free. All right now, gang, 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 that sort of riff. So it's almost like putting some ingredients in a blender, a banana, some strawberries, some ice cubes, and pressing the button. And what comes out doesn't resemble any of the original ingredients, but they're all in there,
Well, I mean, there's a famous story about Paul McCartney, once again, going back to the Beatles, that when he wrote Good Day Sunshine, he was ripping off Daydream by Love and Spoonful.
I believe it, yeah.
And that's what, and those two songs, aside from one says Daydream and one says Good Day Sunshine, aside from that, I don't see any relation to them whatsoever, but that's what he was started. That was his influence.
More the verses, the C7, A7, D7, G7.
Oh,
yeah. So and Daydream.
C. What a day for A.
What a day for maybe E7. yeah, it's all the same kind of tonality. Yeah, I can see it.
I never put it together. I didn't even think it. I was thinking the melody, but it's not. It's when you think of the chord changes, you go, oh, okay.
And it's a shuffle as well. They're both shuffles.
Wow, interesting. Yeah. Well, see, it's interesting because I talked to a few people who have said that you're an incredible craftsman when it comes to writing songs. And I've witnessed it a few times. There's been situations, I think even just a little while ago, I sent you a song that I'd written with somebody and you listened and went, oh, that's good, but do this. And you actually made the change and sent it to me so I knew what it sounded like. And said, just do this. And I went, oh my God, I should cut you in as part of the writing. Don't worry about it. No, thanks. I'm just glad to help a friend, but it's like, you just have this natural knack on being able to figure out how to make something work so fluidly,
You're only talking about the songs that were hits. I mean, you're not talking about.
Once again, you're humble. You've said that before too.
You're not talking about the hundreds of songs I've written that never saw the light of day. So I think it's just a matter of, what do they say? Give 1,000 monkeys 1,000 typewriters and leave them alone for 1,000 years, and they'll write the works of Shakespeare. So it's there's some randomness in it, and there's also a lot of just keep throwing spaghetti at the wall and something will stick eventually. So I mean, I worked long and hard to create music that was successful, but and I say that in that was a lot of songs that never even made it. So there's like days and weeks and months of not wasted work, because I don't think any time is ever wasted when you're being creative, but just nothing came of it. And then every once in a while, you just hit the jackpot. Some random thing happens, and on that day, you write something that is, universal and kind of goes the distance. But believe me, for every song that you know about, and thank you for the compliments, but there are so many more songs that never saw the light of day. So it's a random kind of thing, and I think you're just putting in the time. It's just momentum and time spent and working hard. That's kind of, nothing is accidental. It's all the result of time spent.
Well, they say that a songwriter at best keeps 10% of his material, and at best 10% of that is what goes on record.
I believe it. Yeah.
Because the filtering down, like people just say, "Hey, I wrote this great song." Oh, good. Write me 3,000 more. It's almost like that. It's something that you have to be driven to do. And I never even started writing songs till you mentioned John Hall. I didn't even start even thinking that I could write a song until about 1987, 88. And John Hall, for some reason, he called me out of the blue, and we ended up starting to write songs together. And nothing much turned up from it. I mean, we made some cool little demos, but the songs were all over the place. But at least it got my foot in the door about doing something and seeing the results of my labors, because back in the Shamma days when I first met you, I mean, Jeff and Mike were the writers. I never wrote. I let them do it.
You and me and Mike Cipolle, as I recall, back in about 85, we wrote at least one song. Pilot Light.
No, that was with Jeff.
That was with Jeff. Okay.
I had the demo of that. There's Pilot Light, Misled, which was another good one.
Yeah.
There was a few songs on that, and that was that was your basement in West Vancouver. What had happened was Shamma had split up, and I was working in a music store at the time, and you and Jeff and Mike had gotten together, and you became the drummer in Trauma.
Yeah. And
so you guys started going into your studio and writing songs, and I remember hearing that demo, just going, "Oh my God, this is 1,000 times better than anything Shamma ever did." I was actually so disappointed that I wasn't part of it.
I just remember you being in the mix back then, like we were hanging out and playing.
Well, how it worked actually was that Michael and Jeff Shamma split up. Tommy Stewart was off the road with Trooper, the drummer from Trooper, so they stuck them together. Henceforth, Trauma, Trama, became Trooper and Shamma put together. They did that. Tommy had to go out back on the road, and I'm assuming maybe Brian Wadsworth or Jeff or Michael called you and said, "Would you like to play in a trio with us? We're just doing a couple nights a week."
Yeah.
Then Jeff got a call to join Streetheart, Michael needed a guitar player, and he phoned me, said, "You want to play with Jim?" And I went, "Yeah." And I said, "Yeah." And then I put down the phone. I went, "Wait a minute, I've never played lead guitar in my life," and all of a sudden I'm in a power trio. And so you and Michael and I did a few gigs together, and then Bryan Adams' album, You Got It, started taking off. And I remember you coming to us one night and saying, this is really starting to take off. It looks like Brian's career is really going to go somewhere, and I really should concentrate just on my songwriting and not be playing clubs on weekends anymore. Because for one thing, I'm sure you were probably putting in 10-hour days writing, and then
Oh, well, I mean, as I recall, and maybe this is before you were involved, I think me and Jeff and Mike then, we were doing 5 nights a week.
If I remember correctly, I thought you guys only did Friday, Saturday, but the last 2 sets of each night.
I don't remember. It seemed to me that we were playing more than that, because that around that time, I was doing jingles in the morning as a session drummer. So I'd do a jingle from 9 till noon, and then write with Bryan from 1 o'clock till 8 o'clock, and then go do a gig somewhere from 10 o'clock till 2 o'clock. That was sort of a typical day back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I was burning the candle at both ends.
Well, getting on to the Bryan story, I met Bryan before. I don't think you guys knew each other when I met Bryan. He had just joined Sweeney Todd. I think he was 17. I was 18. He was 17. I remember that.
Before I knew him, yeah.
And I met him at Keencraft Music in Calgary, which ended up becoming Long and McQuaid years and years later. I remember he walked in and we said a few words, and at the time I felt he was just this arrogant kid, but we chatted and stuff, and then he left. And then I was at the Bruce Allen office, and he said hi to me. He had remembered me from Keencraft, and he was singing the chorus to Let Me Take You Dancing. And he was singing coming up the stairs. You guys must have just recorded it and demoed it or something. And he was trying, at the time, I don't know if Bruce was his manager yet, or if he was still trying to get Bruce to be his manager, because there was a bit of friction there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And because I don't think Bruce wanted much to do with him at the time.
Not in the beginning, no. I mean, Bryan really persisted. He just pestered Bruce until Bruce just said yes. I think just to get him to shut up.
Yeah.
But I mean, all for good. But Bryan was persistent and tenacious.
Well, he's tenacious. I mean, there's a guy that went from being one of the biggest stars in the world to also being one of the best photographers in the world. Not everybody gets to take a picture of the Queen of England.
I know.
That's tenacity, man. Good Lord.
A world-class, respected photographer.
It's unbelievable. Like the guy is just such a driven person.
He is. There's nothing he's so brilliant. There's nothing he can't take on and learn and do to a high standard. It's remarkable. He's one of the most amazing people I've ever known.
Wow. So let's get back to that. How did that come together? I'd heard the story that you guys met in Long and McQuaid one day.
We did. So Bryan was living Kitts Point. Long and McQuaid at that time was on 4th Avenue, if you recall.
Yep.
And Bryan lived literally about 2 blocks from there. And he was 18. He'd quit school. He'd quit Sweeney Todd. And he was basically living with his mom and his younger brother. And he was broke and had really no real plan. And he would just go up and hang out at Long and McQuaid and play the guitars and stuff and hang around. So I went in one day and he was in there, and a friend of mine introduced us, and I kind of knew him from Sweeney Todd, and he kind of knew me from Prism, and we just had a quick chat. And I'm sure it's Bryan who suggested we get together and write something. I said, sure. And I gave him my phone number, and 2 days later we got together and wrote a song the first day.
Well, there's no doubt that he caught your eye because you had had such success with Prism. I mean, what a gift to be able to start a project with you at that point, because you were riding high, I think.
Well, I had quit Prism, so I was kind of unemployed too. I didn't really have.
But you'd had success, is what I'm saying. You'd had success as a writer.
Yeah, I'd had some success. Yeah.
Bryan joined Sweeney Todd, but that was much after the days of Roxy Roller with Nick Gilder as the lead singer, and they wrote an album called "If Wishes Were Horses, Beggars Would Ride." I think Martin Scher was the producer of that album. Yeah. And so Bryan proved himself as a new songwriter and a good new voice and all this sort of stuff. But nothing happened with that. So I guess so you're both in a situation where you're not doing anything.
Well, there was friction in that band too. So, Brian just got tired of the drama and quit. So, and again, not to tell stories out of school, but, for me, there was friction in Prism, and it just got to the point where it just wasn't fun anymore. So I quit. So we were both kind of refugees from dysfunctional bands, and kind of, fell together by accident.
I have to say, once again, it was brought to my attention that once again I did something. I mentioned Long and McQuaid without realizing that most people in the world don't know that Long and McQuaid is Canada's biggest music store. It's a chain right across Canada. And back in those days, it was one of many music stores. There still used to be mom and pop stores back in those days, the days that I miss, because that's when you could actually find little gems in the corner. Yeah. But Long and McQuaid pretty much runs Canada now. They're pretty much the music store in Canada.
Every town has one. Yeah.
Yeah. And Annette has a great question, but I want to get to that later. Good. I like what Annette just said. She had made a note to talk about advertising with L&M. I was going to say, okay. So you and Bryan get together like right out of the Long and McQuaid meetup at the music store?
January 1978.
And you start writing right away.
First day, yeah.
And his first album, what year did you say that was?
78.
78. And his first album came out in 79.
79 or 80, I forget which. But we wrote all of 78.
I know. His first album didn't come out till 80, but Let Me Take You Dancing came out of 79.
Yeah, that came out.
That's what it was.
79, yeah. So we wrote all of 1979. I think dozens of songs. Bryan would get on an airplane that he could barely afford at the time, fly back to Toronto, do the rounds of the record companies, and everyone just kept turning him down. So he couldn't get arrested, sadly.
Really?
But
wow.
On one trip to Toronto, A&M Records, after being turned down by the A&R department, the publisher, a guy named
Michael Godin. Oh, sorry. I was thinking about Michael Godin. Sorry.
No, this is before Michael Godin. Michael Godin, I don't know what his early history was with Bryan, but it was actually the publisher, Bryan Chater, who said to Bryan Adams, look, I can't sign you as an artist because I'm the publishing wing of A&M Canada, but I'd like to sign you as a writer. So Bryan Chater signed Bryan and I to a 4-song deal. And that included Let Me Take You Dancing and 3 other songs we'd written around the same time. So we recorded, I guess on an A&M budget, we recorded Let Me Take You Dancing, which was a disco song. And Bryan's voice, he was still 18, so he hadn't even, his voice was still, a work in progress. So he wasn't the voice you know today. It was still quite youthful.
Was that song very speeded?
Well, and then on top of that, we recorded it, and then A&M decided, because it has some moderate success in Canada, A&M wanted to take the song further afield. So they hired a guy named John Luongo, who at the time was a successful producer of disco records. And John Luongo flew up to Vancouver and oversaw, on the original track that Bryan recorded, John Luongo oversaw some additional overdubs, marimba, percussion, and a few things. And then the sort of, almost religious thing back then was a disco song had to be 120 beats per minute.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't, 119 didn't work, 121 didn't work. And I don't remember exactly, but let's say Bryan and I had recorded the song at 115 beats per minute. So Luongo sped it up to 120, and in doing so, slightly chipmunked Bryan's vocal, which Bryan to this day, I think if Bryan could do it, he would buy every copy of that record worldwide and have them all burned.
You can't find it anywhere. I've looked. I've looked for that copy of that record because it was incredibly catchy little song, but it wasn't disco. You know what was amazing to me? You remember the old Tom Snyder show that used to come on after Johnny? Yeah. And I remember I was watching it one day, and his lead-in song that night was "Let Me Take You Dancing." I went, "Oh my God, Bryan's made it." That's what I'm thinking. No?
Well, the song was it never sold any physical copies per se, but it was an in-house hit at discotheques like Studio 54 in New York, and any all the clubs, basically North America wide. It was a hit.
And back then he was still going by the name of Bryan Guy Adams.
I think so. Yeah, I don't recall what's on the label, but that's
I did that research. I remember that. So it was actually, I didn't have to research it. I remembered it.
Yeah.
Sort of photographic memory and that kind of stuff. So then you work on the first album, which was actually quite a good album, and you must have played pretty much everything on the record.
Well,
that's you're drumming on it for sure.
Yeah, we decided to do the album the way we did our demos. Like, we would write a song in my home studio and then cobble a produced, kind of arranged demo together with just the two of us playing everything. So we went in and did the first album that way. But Bryan played guitar and a bit of keyboards, and I played guitar, bass, and drums and a bit of keyboards, and obviously Bryan sang. So it was pretty much me and Bryan doing everything. Stylistically, the album's a bit of a dog's breakfast. There's no sort of uniformity to the style. There's a bit of rock, bit of R&B. Bryan hadn't really found himself as an artist yet. He didn't really, things hadn't coalesced for us as writers or for him as an artist. But it was a great kind of first attempt, and it didn't do well. It didn't sell loads of copies. It got a little bit of airplay here and there, but it was a foot in the door. And it also, I think it helped get Bryan across the border. So at this point, he was a Canadian artist and signed to A&M Canada, and they didn't have a great reach. I mean, they pretty much marketed the Canadian, record thing. But that first album got the attention of A&M USA in LA. So Bryan was able to transfer his contract from Canada to the USA, and then got heavier promotion and support out of the LA office. And the one big thing they did, and they took it to the next level. The first album was sort of produced, arranged, and performed by me and Bryan. The second album, they brought in Bob Clearmountain, who was and still is arguably one of the best engineers / producers on the planet. I mean, and he back at that time, we were so lucky to get him, because he was working with Roxy Music, Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen. He was the busiest guy in the business, and a guy at A&M LA named David Kirschenbaum, who'd done work with Supertramp and Cat Stevens, took a liking to Bryan and hooked him up with Bob Clearmountain, and Bob made all the difference. Bob put together a second album for Bryan that sounded like an artist. It was a unified work, top to bottom. And by this time, Bryan had found his voice. I think we had found a style as writers, and Clearmountain pulled it all together, brought in some great players, Mickey Curry. This is before Keith Scott, I think.
I don't think Keith is on You Want It, You Got It. I don't think he came into Cuts Like a Knife.
Yeah, G.E. Smith, who was the Saturday Night Live guitarist.
Was he on that? Oh, okay. Because that album to me still sounds just, the sound of that, You Want It, You Got It. Like One Good Reason, every time that song comes on, it's just got this, it breathes. That song just sonically sounds so wonderful. Well,
Clearmountain just, between his sounds and the musicians he brought in, I mean, Mickey Curry is just the most wonderful drummer, just in terms of feel and solidity and just musicality.
Wasn't he in Hall & Oates at that time?
He was.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, he was on hiatus from Hall & Oates, so he was available for the sessions. And then he went back on the road with Hall & Oates after that. Bryan kind of begged him, like, do you want to be in my band? And Mickey said, I can't. I'm contracted to be with Hall & Oates. So Mickey stayed another year or so with Hall & Oates. And then when his contract came up, he moved over to Bryan's band. And he's been since.
And that would have been after Reckless, I think, because Reckless still had some other drummers on it, like Pat Stewart.
Yeah, well, there's only two other drummers on Reckless, and I don't remember exactly when Mickey came on board full time as a Bryan Adams band member. But Mickey's on pretty much every song on Reckless, except Summer '69, and I'm not sure why not. scheduling thing, maybe. That's Pat Stewart. And one other song, Heaven, which was actually recorded a year before Reckless, but was included on that album.
Right.
But Mickey started off on the session. Bryan booked a session in New York to record Heaven, and Mickey was on drums. And Mickey said, "Look, I've only got an hour." And Bryan said, "Well, we'll get it done in an hour." Because I think Mickey had a Hall & Oates commitment. So Mickey said, "No, really, I've only got an hour." Anyway, an hour into it, and Mickey, they weren't even close to being done. And Mickey said, I got to go. And he left. And Bryan goes, "Oh, man." So Bryan had been touring with Journey, and I believe Journey's drummer, Steve Smith, must have lived in New York. So Bryan phoned him up and said, "Steve, can you get down to the studio right away?" So Steve Smith came down, and it's him who plays on Heaven.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah.
There's some trivia I never knew.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Well, that's, what was I going to say? So we could go on and on and on about you and Bryan. I mean, good Lord, the hits just kept it coming. Reckless was just such a breakthrough. How many copies did that album finally end up selling? It was way up there.
I would get it wrong, but 20 million maybe.
Say that again.
Maybe 20 million.
Wow. Unbelievable.
15, 20. It's up,
unbelievable.
Yeah.
But there were so many hits on it. It was like they just kept coming and coming, and the song with Tina Turner, like holy smokes, just
she's amazing,
incredible stuff. Yeah, and I remember hearing the story about him going to the Commodore, I think, and pitching the song to her. Yeah, like basically, like once again, there's a tenacious guy. He makes his way backstage saying, "You got to do this song with me." You should go like, "Who are you?"
I know, Yeah, no, Bryan's a force.
He's a force to be reckoned.
Still to this day, he's remarkable.
Well, that's why when I met him, I thought he was this arrogant kid, but he already knew where he was going. Yeah. He had his vision already there. I had no idea what a vision was like. And you hear stories about John Lennon. John Lennon would have been the same way. Yeah,
just focused, and I mean, again, when I met Bryan, along McQuaid when he was 18, I just had a sense. I thought, this kid is unstoppable. I just had a sense of, this is someone I should be connecting with.
Wow. So, okay. So now I mean, we could go on forever, and I've got to cover more stuff with you, and it's going to be tough. This should be like a 3-part story with you. So now, Bryan, you and Bryan wrote a lot until like, okay, so there's Into the Fire. Wake Up the Neighbors. How much was your involvement in that one? That was after Into the Fire, correct? So it was Reckless, Into the Fire, Wake Up the Neighbors? Yeah.
So basically, Bryan and I spent 11 years together, 78 till 89. So after the success of Reckless, and I'll try and make a really long story really short, but after the success of Reckless, it was almost like, okay, where do we go from here? How do we top this? And rather than try and top it, we thought, let's just do something unexpected. Let's do something different. And Bryan had been touring Amnesty International fundraising tour with U2 and Springsteen and others. And he came back from that tour kind of fired up to write lyrics that were more topical and political and
hence Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
Right.
So Into the Fire and the song Into the Fire. I'm trying to remember. We tried to write songs that were more than about boys and girls and love songs. We tried to write things with a bit of meat to it, and so also arrangement-wise, we wanted to incorporate some instrumentation that was more kind of current or like again, U2 were a big influence at the time. So we went off in this direction that ultimately, after selling 15 or 20 million copies on Reckless, I think out of the gate, Into the Fire sold a little over 1 million copies, which by any standard is still respectable, but compared to Reckless, it was a disappointment. So we kind of started to burn out around that. I mean, we've been spending almost every day together for 11 years, and it was just, I think you have to take a break at some point. And so we just started to drift apart a bit. and we'd already started writing songs for Waking Up the Neighbors. And it just got to the point where we weren't having much fun and not really doing great work. I mean, we just weren't on the same page anymore. So by this time, Mutt Lange had come in also. Bryan had been able to, again, with tenacity and persistence, after being told no 2 or 3 times, Mutt finally went, okay, yes. So Mutt, Mutt came into the picture. Just the loveliest, most amazing guy, as you can imagine, hugely talented and brings so much to the table. So Mutt and Bryan and I were co-writing, and then I just kind of removed myself from the project. My son had just been born, and when you have a child, suddenly your life changes anyway. So for a bunch of reasons, I just kind of removed myself from the project. So Mutt and Bryan finished the album. So I'm only represented on, I forget, you'd have to help me here, but
That was Waking Up the Neighbors?
yeah,
Okay.
maybe half the songs or fewer. But then I went on to write, and Bryan also wanted my exclusivity. He wanted me to only write at that time with him and for him. And I was starting to get some great offers from Aerosmith and others. So I just thought this is the time to just move on and go and try something different.
Before we get to Aerosmith, because that's an exciting thing too, you once told me about writing in the hotel rooms with Bryan on the road. And I remember this is back in the days before people had drum machines, all that stuff. And sort of, I remember you said something about having an SM57, and you'd use that for the drum machine. You sort of have the kick was when you hit your index finger on the microphone, and the snare was when you hit it on the table. So boom, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you do a little drum track, so that you guys could make these little demos in the hotel room.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear those ones. That'd be amazing.
They're around somewhere in a box of tapes somewhere.
Incredible. So obviously by this time, in no small part due to you, and then Fairburn into Loverboy, because we talked about this with Mike Reno. Fairburn into Loverboy, and then Loverboy. All of a sudden, the world starts hearing the sound that's coming out of Vancouver, and you start getting calls from the Bon Jovis and Aerosmith and all that stuff. So all of a sudden, now Aerosmith is coming to town. And I remember meeting Steven Tyler and Joe Perry at Outlaws. They came in. I was playing there one night, and they walked in. I was like what? What are these guys doing here? And of course, they were there to start the Permanent Vacation album. And you were such an integral part of that album. So I remember hearing a story about Steven Tyler buying boy or Girl Guide cookies in your yard or something when you guys are writing on the back.
Well, I mean, it was, that particular story, it was a beautiful summer day. I don't remember what song we were working on. Might have been Ragdoll or something from the first album from Permanent Vacation. So Steven and I were just working on lyrics. The melody and the track were pretty much done. And we went out in my backyard. There's a picnic table back there, and we were sitting there working on lyrics. And unbeknownst to us, some Girl Guides knocked on the front door. So my wife answered the door and said, just go around back. There's a couple of guys back there who'd be delighted to buy some of your cookies. And so they sent these Girl Guides back. They were like 10 years old,
Yeah.
And they had, of course, no idea that it was Steven Tyler.
Yeah. But so when you were writing with them, I remember, was there not an instance that I read somewhere where you basically said, I think you referred to one of their earlier songs and said, do you have a song that sounds like this? And I forget which one it was. It might have been Ragdoll. It was just a feel. And also Ragdoll, we were talking to Mike Fraser, and he talked about how that song was ragtime almost right up until the very end. And I listened, and there's one area where there's a 2-track. You can hear Steven Tyler's old harmony vocal, and it says ragtime, but he actually sings Ragdoll over top of it. It's still on. Okay. It's still there.
Okay, yeah.
Mike Fraser told me to look for it. He says, yeah, if you listen to the backup, ragtime is still in there. And I listened all the way through the song, and right about 3/4 away, right towards the end, when it goes into the tag, Steven Tyler sings Ragtime as a backup over top of him singing Ragdoll.
I didn't know that. I'll have to look for it.
Yeah, no, it's funny. So yeah, so it was Ragtime, but I guess Kolodner said you can't have a song called Ragtime. It's going to be too suggestive. So.
Yeah, that was the first song I wrote with Stephen and Joe. But yeah, I mean, I don't think Ragtime was well, the reason we called it Ragtime was we were kind of doing a New Orleans shuffle kind of a song. So
right.
You know, it was rock and roll, but it also had kind of Southern influences, and we just thought Ragtime was a great title, and it would have stayed Ragtime. But John Kolodner, who was a very opinionated A&R guy, sometimes he was right, and sometimes he wasn't, and I'm not sure this really matters either way. But he didn't like the title Ragtime. He did, and he was like emphatic, just sorry, if that's the title, it's not going on the record. So. We just thought of 100 other titles, and John didn't like any of them. So he brought Holly Knight, another songwriter, flew up from LA. And, I hope I'm correct telling the story, because I don't want to take anything away from her. But I think she just went through our list of other titles, and there was, in the lyric, in the verses,
the word ragdoll is in the lyric.
Yeah, it's like ripping up a rag doll. That's in the verse. So whether she spotted it there or somewhere else, she just said, "What about rag doll?" And Kolodner liked that. So,
and it was already there.
Yeah. So again, not to take anything away from Holly, but that was kind of her contribution. But it got us across the finish line. And John did the same thing a few years later, a song called Deuces Are Wild that I wrote with Stephen. John said, I don't like the title. And Stephen said, I love the title. And John said, well, change the title or it's not going on the album. And Stephen didn't change the title, and it didn't go on the album. That's the power that John had.
Wow. No, but Deuces Are Wild, it ended up getting released for a movie. And aren't you playing everything on it? Yeah,
so that's another story.
I hope I'm not giving anything away here.
You're not, no. So it's so the song, because it got kicked off the album, it never even got properly recorded by Aerosmith. John Kolodner kind of nixed it before it even got to the point of going into the studio. 3 or 4 years later, a movie soundtrack came up, an opportunity for Aerosmith to have a song in a movie, and they presented mine and Stephen's demo of Deuces Are Wild, which is me playing everything, guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, and Stephen singing and playing harmonica. We presented that to the movie company. They loved the song. So I guess Fairburn and Mike Fraser maybe went in, and Joe Perry added some slide guitar, and Joey Kramer did some drums, some fills. But other than that, the drums, the bass, and the guitar and everything is me. And even the slide guitar, and Joe plays a second slide on top of mine. Wow. So it's basically me and Stephen and Joe.
Steven Tyler has got, we talked about this with Mike Fraser, he's got the best body rhythm, I think, of anybody. And Fraser says his pitch is so good in the studio. It's like, he just, give me another track, he says, and they're all flawless.
Yeah, he's amazing. Steven.
Yeah, so great people to write with?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, the energy. Steven is almost like an unruly kindergarten kid. You have to manage him a little bit. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, because he's a brilliant guy. But literally, you can drop a pencil. He goes, oh, that sounds great. Let's sample that. He gets very distracted,
Well, Scott's brought this up before, that Stephen apparently I think it was back in the Rocks album, that first shaker, he used a sugar packet because they didn't have a shaker in the studio. So he shook. Yeah. So, like, he's just one of those guys that, he'll dance in the studio to create a rhythm with his feet, He's
remarkable. He's a remarkable human being. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. But, I remember seeing them. We did a gig in Sweden where we played after Guns N' Roses, but the night before it was Aerosmith, and I had to see Aerosmith. I'd never seen them live. And you talk about rock stars.
Yeah.
Oh, good Lord. They came out on stage and I was just like, My mouth is open. There's actually a picture of me watching them like this. Like literally, my mouth is open the whole time. My mouth is open so wide you could see a guy's head behind me. It's like incredible.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I saw them play live, we'd already written together for at least 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something we'd spent in the basement. I'd never seen them perform, but just me and Stephen and Joe in the basement writing. And then one night they decided they needed to just let off some steam. So they went down, the Payolas, I think, were playing at Club Soda. Remember Club Soda?
Yeah, of course.
What was it on, Hornby? Or?
Yeah, it was on, it might have been on Hornby.
No, it wasn't Hornby.
Because there was Richards which was on Richards, and then Club Soda was the next street over. Hornby was the next street up. So I forget. Yeah, we know where it is, though. It was somewhere in Vancouver. It's an apartment now. Yeah.
So they went down there. There was maybe 100 people in the club, and Aerosmith just went on unannounced and used the Payolas gear. I'd never seen them perform before. So we're talking little tiny club, and the stage was one step up from the dance floor. So I mean, they were in your face, and I was just gobsmacked. They were so amazing, just unbelievable.
What blew my mind is how much of the guitar playing that I've always thought was Joe Perry isn't Joe Perry.
Yeah, correct.
I mean, Brad Whitford is an incredible player.
I know,
and he's one of the, and he's like the what's his name? Bill Wyman. He stands at the back of the stage still, and he's doing all this wild stuff. Well, Joe Perry's the rock star up front, but Brad Whitford's doing, I hate to say it, to me at least 60 or 70% of what I love about Aerosmith.
And the first guy to credit him is Joe Perry. Joe Perry reveres Brad, and he will take every opportunity to say, I'm nothing without Brad. Yeah.
Well, but Joe is the ideas guy, obviously, because him and Stephen write all.
Joe's Joe's a riff guy. Joe has, you can wind him up and he will come up with 100 riffs. And Ragdoll just started when, like I say, it's the first song I wrote with Stephen and Joe on the first day I met them, and all Joe had was this riff. Dun, 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 dun. And he just kept playing that over and over again, but it didn't go anywhere. But it was just a one note, one key riff. So I picked up the bass and put some movement under it, and then Stephen started scatting nonsense kind of syllables to Joe's riff, and then it like really quickly coalesced into a song. So that's kind of their method of working. It'll often start with a Joe Perry riff, and Stephen will mimic that melody vocally, and then it starts to become a song.
Would that have been in your studio?
Yeah.
Not in the backyard. That would have been in the studio where you did that.
No, yeah. The only reason we went out in the backyard was just to sit and, writing lyrics is painful. Always.
I hate it.
I need Girl Guide cookies.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Between lyric for Oh, there we go. And that just says it was on Homer Street.
Homer Street. There you go.
Yeah, that's it.
I knew it started with an H. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I remember Mark LaFrance telling me a story that you had called him one time. He says, I need you to come over to your home studio. I need you to come over and do a vocal. Okay, straight. So he shows up, and there's Alice Cooper at the door. Yeah. And you're writing with Alice Cooper.
Yeah.
So now we're getting into this whole thing. So Bryan has said, I want your exclusivity as a writer. You're going, well, but I'm sort of feeling like we've reached our pinnacle at this point. Maybe we could use a break. But you're getting calls from these amazing people. You end up not only with Aerosmith, you're writing with Ozzy Osbourne, with Alice Cooper, like all the people. Do you have a list off the top of your head? I mean, it's incredible, some of the co-writes you've done. And also, I got to ask this before it gets away from me. Annette asked a long time ago, do you prefer writing with other people, or do you prefer writing, like I'm sure a lot of the stuff, your earlier stuff you did on your own, do you prefer writing with other people? I remember one time you said you liked writing on bass because you could move the chord.
Yeah, I mean, that's one. I mean, I'm always looking for different ways of writing. You're always looking for inspiration. Sometimes buying a new keyboard with a new sound can take you down a direction you didn't normally have gone. But yeah, I do love collaborating. But maybe not for the reasons you would think. I mean, the first Prism album I wrote pretty much on my own. Well, there's no co-writes. I mean, my 7 songs were written by me, but then I also had a band ready to record them. So once you're just a freelance songwriter who can't sing, I mean, I'm the world's worst singer, you need someone to sing your songs. You need a vehicle. So I recognized along McQuaid, or shortly afterwards, that Bryan was going to be that guy. You know, I didn't even know Bryan was a writer when we first connected. I just thought, okay, here's a kid who can sing my songs. And
your new Ron Tabac sort of thing.
Yeah. So as it turns out, he was also a very talented songwriter. So we ended up being co-writers. But when you're not an artist and you can't sing, you need someone to sing your songs for you. So, and the other thing is, as I've discovered again and again during my career as a songwriter, you can write the most Aerosmith sounding song in the whole world, but try getting it to Aerosmith, and even harder, try getting them to record it. Why would they? You know. But if you sit in a room with the artist and write a song with them that they contributed to, have an interest in, creatively, spiritually, financially, it's probably going to end up on their album. So again, if you want to actually have a career and make a living as a songwriter, you have to actually get songs on albums. And the best way to get a song on an album is to write it with the person who's going to eventually sing it. So that was a big motivator for me in terms of being a full-time collaborator.
I'm hoping to parlay that story right now into when you and Bryan wrote the song for Kiss. Do you mind telling that story?
We wrote 2 songs for Kiss, but
there was the one where you got the call from Gene Simmons. This is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So Gene Simmons. Well, first of all, we got a call one day. The phone rings and my wife answers, and she goes, "Jim, it's Michael Jackson." I went, "What?" So, hello? He goes, "Hi, Jim. This is Michael James Jackson, the producer in Toronto." So it's Michael James Jackson. But he was producing Kiss. He was producing, I forget the name of their album, Creatures of the Night or something like that. Yeah, I think it was called Creatures of the Night. He says, "Look, I'm a Canadian. I'm producing Kiss. I'm aware of you and Bryan." This is 1982, so Bryan and I hadn't quite, lit the world on fire yet as songwriters. But Michael James Jackson, who happened to be a Canadian, knew of us, and said, "I'd love to put you in touch with Gene Simmons." So great. This was like a big break for Bryan and I as young writers. So I'm trying to remember quite how this unfolded, but Gene had a riff. No, we started, I think the first song was a song I'd actually written for BTO called Rock and Roll Hell. And we sent that to Gene, and he liked it. So he phoned us, and Bryan and I are on the phone with Gene Simmons, which was quite a thrill. So I'm on one phone and Bryan's on the other phone. We can see each other, and we're talking to Gene Simmons. And Gene says, I love the song. We're going to record it. And Bryan and I are like, great. He says, there's just one problem. It needs a third verse. There are only 2 verses. And Bryan and I look at each other like, we say, actually, Gene, it doesn't need a third verse. And Gene says, yes, it does. And I'm going to write it. So that was our sort of introduction to.
Hey, it didn't need a third verse. He just wanted his name on it.
Of course. And I guess what he was saying, and this points back to my whole thing, is if you want to get a song on an album, the artist wants to have an interest in it. I mean, they're not, unless it's a completely non-writing artist, like say Tina Turner or Joe Cocker, who don't write their own songs. They rely specifically on songs from outside songwriters.
But even that can be doctored up. Look at Colonel Tom Parker with Elvis. He wrote him into all the songs. Elvis never wrote one note or had one word. There he is on the credits.
Yeah.
If you want to do my boy to do your songs, he's going to be in the credits.
Yeah. I mean, and to Gene's credit, he did legitimately contribute a third verse, but it was very clear to us that if we wanted the song on the album, we had to let Jim in on the songwriting act. And so
you're working with Aerosmith and that sort of thing, but now you end up with the Ozzy Osbourne camp and all that stuff. Now, how does that happen? Is that because of the work you did with Aerosmith, or was that pre that? I'm not sure the timeline here.
sorry, which camp?
When you were working with Ozzy Osbourne and people like that. And I was actually going to hopefully get that's what Scott was saying, is I was hoping to get maybe off the top of your head a list of some of the people you've co-written with of note.
I mean, I'm literally opening up my computer here. I'll miss somebody, but and this is hardly even a full list, but going down here, Joan Jett, Michael Bublé, Joe Cocker, Alice Cooper, we've already mentioned, Roger Daltrey from The Who, Neil Diamond did a song of ours, Glass Tiger, Canadian band, I did quite a bit with them.
Yeah, that was a great album, by the way, and you produced that album too.
Good guys. We're still really good friends. The Go-Go's. I had a big hit with Heart, a song called What About Love.
Oh, that was your song? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a huge hit.
It was really big. It was their big comeback in the middle of their career. A couple of things for Loverboy, Bret Michaels, Anne Murray, number one song with her, Ted Nugent.
Which one was with Anne Murray?
It was called Now and Forever. I wrote it with David Foster.
Oh, okay. I remember that.
That was the number one song in south of the border. Paolas, Bonnie Raitt.
I'd love to see your Rolodex.
Scorpions, German heavy metal band. That was fun.
Yeah, I think Mark sang on that too, I think he told me.
Yes, he did, yeah.
Yeah.
Rick Springfield, Rod Stewart, Tina Turner, we've mentioned.
Rick Springfield. That's an interesting thing, because back when I was with the Ron Tabak Band, after Prism split up, and they hadn't really split up, I decided that they wanted to go on a whole new thing, and they had Henry Small come in as the lead singer and all that stuff. So Ron Tabak has nothing to do. Rocket Norton puts on his executive outfit and decides he's going to be Ron's manager, and forms a band around him, which had me on guitar. So there was Ron Tabak, Donnie Underhill from Trooper, John Hall from Prism, Rocket on drums, and me on guitar, and Ron. Now, one of the songs we opened with was Jamaica, which was your song that you've written. But that song went to Rick Springfield, and he changed the title to Christina. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that song, I wrote that for BTO, and it was called Jamaica. And BTO recorded it. This is after Randy. This is Fred Lewis.
Rock and Roll Nights album.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so, as Rick told me later, he was on an airplane to somewhere, and his guitar player was sitting next to him, and somehow that song came to the attention of the guitar player, and his guitar player said, "Hey, check this out." So Rick's listening to it on the airplane, and went, "Wow, I love this." But I don't love the title. So Rick rewrote the lyrics, and instead of Jamaica, called it Christina. And the next thing I know, I get a call not from Rick, but his management saying, "Look, do you have any objections to Rick rewriting the lyrics and putting it on his next album?" Which absolutely, of course, I didn't. And to this day, it's the song that Rick either opens his show with, or it's his encore song.
Well, it's funny because I did a casino back about 2 years ago, and I saw it on the set list because they had one of his old set lists taped to the wall. Sometimes you go in the back. Yeah. And there was casino on the list. So I made note of that. So he's a lovely guy, actually. I remember when Jeff and Bernie and I were playing together when we first formed the band Paradox. And I think you came down and saw us one night, as a matter of fact. We were playing it by then. The Outlaws Club that I talked about earlier with Steven Tyler and Joe Perry had now changed its name to the Metro. Yep. And we were playing there. And I'm playing one night, and I'd met his crew the night before. They loved the band. And all of a sudden, I'm playing, and I finished, and I look back at the board, and there's Rick Springfield at the soundboard watching me sing. And it's really incognito. He's got these weird glasses on. He's got kind of a hat on, overcoat, because he was a sex symbol. I mean, girls were all over him, but he was really downplaying it. Nobody knew it was him, but I figured it out, right? So I walked up to him and he says, man, you're too good for this town. You got to go to LA, man. It was like really a nice thing for him to say. Of course, it wouldn't have happened, but I mean, it was nice that he was that forthcoming and being so complimentary, you know.
He's a really sweet guy. I love Rick.
He really is a nice guy.
To this day, he's as big and maybe bigger Beatles fan than you and me. He's like
really
a huge Beatles fan. Yeah.
Well, I remember he had quite an active part in David Grohl's movie Sound City.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, did you see that movie?
I didn't know.
Oh God, you have to see it. Oh, Jim, it's right up your alley. We'll talk about it later. It's fantastic. Okay. Oh yeah, it's right up your alley. But anyway, so Ozzy Osbourne, working with him, we had Rudy Sarzo on the show, which was his bass player.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we sort of got his angle, but what was it like working with Ozzy?
Oh, I love Ozzy. He's the funniest guy and hugely talented and smart and kind and generous. I just love him to pieces. But that came about, and again, I'm not quite sure how I came on to his radar, but it was his producer, a guy named David Beinhorn, who had done Black Hole Sun.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Love that tune. I love that tune. Oh my God.
Me too. Yeah.
Oh,
Soundgarden. Yeah, great record. So Beinhorn called me one day. I didn't know him, never met him. Just out of the blue, got a call from him saying, "I'm producing Ozzy's next album. I'd love you to write with him if you're interested," which of course I was. And so Ozzy flew up to Vancouver, and we spent a couple of weeks together and came up with a couple of songs. But I mean, he's everything you would think. He's like very eccentric and very English and very funny. And speaking of Beatle fans, again, he's like, like you and me, just an off the wall Beatle fan, just lives with the Beatles.
Unbelievable. So here's a question: how does a guy like Ozzy Osbourne come to Vancouver for 2 weeks and nobody knows? Where does he hide out?
I don't know. I mean, the few times that I have gone out, for dinner with Ozzy or Steven Tyler or something in Vancouver, they get recognized. And we did go out for dinner one night with Ozzy. I remember that. I remember two things from that night. One was parking the car and walking to the restaurant, and there was a homeless guy kind of passed out on the sidewalk, and he got up against the wall, and he kind of opens his eyes and goes, "Ozzy Osbourne?" That was. Yeah. And the other thing was they had arranged I forget what restaurant it was. I won't remember the name of it, but it was on the corner of Smythe and Dinsmore. I won't remember. But they had arranged for us to sit upstairs, so Ozzy would have a bit of privacy. And we had a nice dinner. And then on the way back down, there was a party of maybe 10 or 15 people, and it was a birthday party. They recognized Ozzy. "Ozzy, what are you doing here?" And Ozzy stopped and chatted with him, and gave him his time and a few autographs. I mean, just really, really generous. But he had that TV show too, one of the first so-called reality shows.
Yeah.
With like the Osbournes. Yeah. And so some people came to know him just as a member of the Osbourne family. And Ozzy told me a story once about being in an elevator in a hotel, and he was recognized by someone else in the elevator. And they said, "Ozzy Osbourne, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm in town to do a concert." "You sing too?" They only knew him from the TV show.
So incredible. Because on that show, of course, he comes off as a bumbling rube, I
know. That's why I went out of my way just now to say he's not an idiot. He comes across that way, and he does mumble, and he's sometimes even difficult to understand, and he appears to be a bit of a dolt. But exactly the opposite is true. He's smart. He's a clever songwriter, great with lyrics and melodies. Knows exactly who his fans are. I mean, he's really astute. He's sharp. He's very sharp.
Mike Fraser touched on the whole thing. You were talking about going to the restaurant and stuff and hiding out. Mike Fraser said that was a wonderful thing about when bands came to Vancouver, is they felt they could actually go out into the public. And yes, people would recognize them and they would sign autographs, but then they would leave them alone. They weren't hounded by the paparazzi thing, but he says that's starting to change now. Vancouver's becoming like the Hollywood thing where there's camera people and people following people everywhere and trying to get the story and all that stuff. He says, so it's losing its charm for a lot of these people. Vancouver used to be a lot cooler that way. You know? I think people enjoy themselves coming up here.
Yeah. I mean, Stephen and Joe used to go out and sit in front of Little Mountain Sound, you know, on a sunny day, take some chairs outside and sit in the sunshine and you know, no one would bother them. I mean, some fans would come by, but they, you know, they were always generous with fans. But yeah, you're right. In Vancouver, they could kind of get away from, you know, the big cities and the fans and the paparazzi, and it was a good place to hang out.
Yeah. So now I'd be remiss. We've talked about Beatles before, but you did something that I thought was just absolutely amazing, and I don't think I've ever really talked to you about it. There was a situation where all the people were called into Abbey Road Studios and they were to use the old gear, the actual old 4-track recorder. Jeff Emmerich was going to engineer it, and you guys were going to redo songs from the Sgt. Pepper's album using the gear the Beatles did. And you and Bryan got to do Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, correct?
Yeah. So the BBC for the 20th, 30th, 40th, I forget what even year it was. You'll have to help me with that. Anniversary of the release of Sgt. Pepper, BBC decided to do a documentary of...
It would have been the 40th.
40th, okay.
Yeah.
Of various bands recording Beatles songs using the original gear and the original engineer, Jeff Emmerich, and the original assistant engineer, Richard Lush. And it was Oasis and... you'll have to look this up because I don't remember all the bands that were on there.
Charles will look all this up for us.
Yeah.
He's good that way.
Yeah. So Oasis was one of the bands, and then Bryan got asked. Now, the only sort of bummer was it wasn't at Abbey Road Studios. Oasis did end up doing theirs at Abbey Road, but we did ours at Mark Knopfler's studio.
Oh.
Yeah. But they did bring in the original gear. So we had one of the REDD desks from Abbey Road, and microphones from Abbey Road, 4-track tape machines from Abbey Road. Jeff Emmerich engineered, and Richard Lush, who was the assistant engineer on Pepper, who now lives in Australia, he flew in for the sessions. So it was me and Bryan, Elliot Kennedy on bass, and guitar. Colin, I can't remember his last name, I'm sorry. Good friend of Bryan's. So just the four of us. So we did the opening track, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club theme. And then they brought in 4 French horns from the London Symphony to overdub, you know.
And all that.
Wow.
So what was it like working with Jeff Emmerich? Did he give you some pointers on Ringo's playing?
Well, yeah. Because I was on drums, and Jeff kept saying, and I'm a pretty heavy hitter.
Yeah, you are. You're not a soft guy, that's for sure.
I hold the stick backwards and I slam the snare drum, and he kept saying, hit it harder. He said, Ringo hit really hard. You know, I know. The one sort of gem we got from Jeff, and I'm sure this story is, you know, not new, and then might not have been exclusive to that particular telling, but he said how when he took over, so he started. Norman Smith was the original engineer for the Beatles, right from the very
yeah, Hurricane Smith.
Yeah, and Jeff was pretty early on. At age 16, I think he joined EMI, and he was Norman Smith's assistant for most of the Beatle albums, all through Help and Revolver and Rubber Soul and all that. And if you've read Jeff's biography,
yeah, I did.
Yeah, you know, he says that there he was standing, you know, behind Norman Smith, listening to these Beatle albums getting made year after year after year after year, and thinking, you know, given the chance, I could get better sounds, you know. And finally one day, Norman Smith quits to become his own artist and producer, right?
Right.
Hurricane Smith.
Yeah.
And he also went on to produce Pink Floyd. As an independent producer.
Well, his song was "Oh Babe, what do you say?"
Yeah.
He had an odd voice.
I know, but it was a number one single. It was a hit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
So age 19, Jeff Emmerich gets called into the office, and they say, Jeff, we'd like to know if you'd like to be head engineer for the Beatles. Age 19. And he was like, he said, I need to go home and talk to my parents about it.
Could you imagine?
Wow.
I know, which he did. Anyway, so he came on. Jeff Emmerich's first album was Revolver. And he said one of the first things he did, and you'll know these stories as well, that the engineering at EMI was like, there was a list of things you could do and couldn't do. You could not put a microphone any closer than 12 inches to a bass drum, for example, because none of the equipment, they didn't want anything damaged. They didn't want the diaphragm of the microphone damaged. So there was a list of how to make a record, 12 inches from the bass drum, 24 inches from a guitar amp, and so on. And you could only add this much top end to anything. The treble EQ could only go so far, 10K, 2 dB, anything more you can get fired. So he said, at risk of being fired, one of the first things he did on his first day was he had Ringo take the front head off his bass drum. And if you remember the movie Help, there's one scene in the movie where someone had knit a sweater with
8 arms to hold you.
Yeah.
It was a sweater with 8 arms. Yeah.
Sweater had, and four necks, and right. All 4 Beatles wore one big sweater. Well, somehow that sweater ended up at Abbey Road Studios, and Jeff had Ringo take the front head off his bass drum. He put that sweater inside the bass drum, and then put the microphone in the bass drum.
Never been done before.
He said, never been done before. All of it could have got him fired, but that was, among other things, what he brought to the.
Well, I remember a quote from George Martin saying, "Okay, you want to put the mics that close to the drums, you're going to blow them up. You're going to have to pay for them out of your own pocket."
Yeah.
So it was really at his own risk.
Yeah.
And that became the way drums have been mic'd forever, ever since that.
I know.
It's just incredible. And it was just like, and he's a young kid that's just going, well, I think it was probably Tomorrow Never Knows, or She Said, where they wanted a bigger, fatter drum sound. And he says, I think I have an idea.
Yep. Yeah. Compression, with the compressors, I forget what they were called. They had,
the Fairlight?
Fairchild.
Fairchild
compressors. Yeah. On She Said.
Yeah.
And EQ on maybe that was Norman Smith though. Nowhere Man, the guitar solo. Very, very bright. John Lennon said, "I want more top end on that," and Norman Smith said, "I'm not allowed to," and John said, "Do it anyway." So they're very restrictive in terms of what was permitted. But I mean, especially once Jeff came on board, they just broke all the rules.
Well, it was such a lab coat place. And what blew my mind about that book was when they talk about how, and people that are like recording in the recording business nowadays are going to laugh at this, because generally, if you're an engineer, you might work your way up from sandwich boy to like what Mike Fraser talked about, where he was literally hired as a janitor and was working sessions within 4 months. But he didn't know anything about anything. He just, because he was cleaning things, he got to know what this microphone was and where they were putting it, and he literally learned on the job.
I remember Mike getting hired. I was at Little Mountain every day as a session drummer. So I remember Mike coming in, this kid, like sweeping the floors and wrapping the microphone cables. I mean, sweet, quiet guy.
Yeah.
I remember Bob Rock when he was just kind of the T-boy,
Yeah, unbelievable.
These guys all came up and had huge careers.
But the thing is that nowadays, if you're an engineer, that's your job. You're an engineer, and you'll be an engineer. You'll continue to be an engineer. Or if you're this, you'll continue to be that. If you're, let's say, if you're a tape op, if you're using tape, that's your job. In Abbey Road, you'd be on a job for 2 months and you'd be working, doing engineering for the Beatles and stuff, and say, okay, everybody switch. What? Everybody would switch. Now the guy that's doing, who's doing the, record pressing in that room is now coming in as the engineer for the Beatles. And I think that's one of the things where the Beatles were getting upset. And I think they actually sort of requested Jeff because they liked his style and they liked him as a kid. And they figured, we got to have one guy that we can deal with, as opposed to every time we do a session, it's a different guy.
Yeah.
It was a weird way to do business. Like, what a strange situation.
They had to invent it as it went along, because it was the beginnings of technology in terms of recording. It was growing exponentially back in those days, from 2-track to 4-track to 8-track. I mean, just over the course of their short career, they went from 2-track to, I think 16-track was the last thing they had, I believe, in Abbey Road.
I think Abbey Road might have been 16. I think you're right. Yeah, I think the White Album was 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And before that, Help was 4, and the first album was 2 tracks.
Yeah. Well, and then when they did Live at the Hollywood Bowl, I think it was a 3-track machine. Yeah. That's when they decided to re-release it years later, they found some old machine that I think they had to put dry ice on or something because it kept overheating just to transfer it. So they transferred to a regular machine so they could actually mix the album. You and I think you and I and Michael went out for dinner in London back a few years ago. You took us out for dinner. Thank you very much. That was lovely, actually. And at that time, you'd still not met Paul McCartney, but you'd talked about meeting him in a New York restaurant. And it was like he was at the next table and you gave him a chair. But since then, you've actually, what you mean, about Jeff Lynne's place or something? Is this correct?
I've met him a couple of times since then. One was backstage when he played New York a couple of years ago. And another time, Bryan and I did an album with Jeff Lynne a couple of years ago. And Jeff obviously is very close to the Beatles. He produced the, a couple of
anthology stuff, and all that. Yeah. Free as a Bird.
And also the George Harrison albums. Jeff did those. So we did an album with Jeff, and we went to see Jeff perform at Hyde Park in London. ELO, Jeff Lynne's ELO it was called, and McCartney was side stage. We're watching the concert from the side of the stage, and I'm standing right next to Paul McCartney. And then we had an opportunity to chat afterwards, but as a fan, I'm just like, hardly can speak. It's Paul McCartney, and I had met him before that. I had met him once previously, and his wife Nancy remembered meeting me before, and she said, "You connected with Bryan Adams, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's right." She goes, "What is it? Are you his father?"
Oh no! Oh God!
I know. I'm 7 years older than Bryan, but.
Hey Jim, did it dawn on you as you're standing there and you're talking to Paul McCartney? When we started the show today with you, you talked about your original influence that got you hooked, and that was the Beatles. Did you reflect on that as now you're there talking with them?
I suppose. I mean, not maybe consciously, but certainly subconsciously, you're kind of like, wow, this guy has been, I've played zero role in his life, but he has been like 90% of my life, So there's certainly that imbalance. But yeah, you go, wow, this is like a guy I've waited my whole life to meet.
Yeah, he's the guy that brought us all to the dance.
Yeah, and you, of course, are tempted to say that. Yeah, I would love to have said, "You're the reason I became a musician and had a career," but you don't, and you'd want to say, "You're the reason I'm right-handed, but I play guitar left-handed," but you don't. If I ever had a chance to spend an extended period of time with him and things got relaxed enough, I think I'd tell him that. But
wow.
Nor do you want to. There's nothing he hasn't heard before, either from fans, But he's so gracious. He first of all, he knows you're freaking out. He knows he's Paul McCartney, he knows you're a fan, and he knows you're freaking out, and he goes out of his way to make you feel comfortable and okay. He's been famous since he was 20.
I remember when you and I went to see the Beatles. When we went to see Paul McCartney at Air Canada Center back a few years.
Yep.
It was me and you and Fred Turner and a bunch of us. We all got together and went. But that afternoon, a friend of mine who was a drummer, pipe and drum guy,
Yep.
and they did Mull of Kintyre. And one of the very few times he does Mull of Kintyre on his tour is in Canada, because it actually went to #1 in Canada. He doesn't play it in the States. So they get all the best pipers and drummers from all over Canada to come in and do this show.
Yep.
Now, so a friend of mine, because I was going to go to, I already knew I was going to the show. I performed a couple of nights for the Toronto Maple Leafs just before that. And part of our deal was they were going to get us in to see the Beatles or see McCartney, pardon me. So he checks into the same hotel as I do. And I said, well, I'll go down and hang out with you before you guys go in to rehearse with Paul. I don't realize that none of these guys know each other. So the pipers think I'm a drummer. The drummers think I'm a piper. So I'm neither. I'm just hanging out with Dan. So all of a sudden the doors open, boom, everybody in. I was like, so I'm swept in. Dan says, here, hold one of my bags, right? So I grab one of his bags and up this elevator we go. And now I'm up at the rafters and I'm looking down and there's Paul McCartney's stage. And it's like, I'm going, what am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. So then all of a sudden it's like, okay, time to go down for rehearsal. So we go down and now they've got to go up and they got to do a rehearsal with Paul, or pardon me, with his stage manager before Paul gets there. So I go down and I go down with them and I got nothing to do. So I sit in the front row. And so I guess they assumed that I was the manager of this pipe and drum corps, because I'm the only person that shouldn't be in the room, but they're checking everybody else. It was like the weirdest thing. So I'm trying to make a long story short, but it ended up where Paul McCartney was entering the room and I got called from the front to the back to where Paul McCartney is going to enter. And as I'm walking by, and I've said this before on the show, there's McCartney's Hofner bass he played on the Beatles Ed Sullivan show. His Yesterday Epiphone, his every guitar, his She Said Casino, like all the guitars, he still plays those guitars. You'd think he'd be out with relics, but he's actually playing the real. And I'm going by, you could feel I was vibrating.
Wow.
Anyway, so my big claim to fame, I walk out. And so we're there, and they said, "Okay, you got to clear." McCartney's entering the building. He was still with Heather at the time. They'd just been married a year before or so, and so they clear the thing back. But I was the first person there. So he walks by and he looks at me. He goes, "Hey, lay low, mate." And I went, "Like, what do you say?" I was gonna, "Okay, I will." I was just like, "Oh my God, McCartney, talk to me." But I'm watching him rehearse with the pipe and drum corps and stuff. He's exactly that. He lets everybody relax. It's just me. And one of the things, sorry, I gotta tell this too. One of the things on that tour, I believe Lexus underwrote that concert tour. So part of it was people that bought Lexus cars or something. They got to come into a sound check with Paul McCartney, and I happened to be there for this. So there's all these people near the soundboard are brought in. Now by that time, I'm sitting up in the rafters. And this girl had walked by, and I get tapped on the shoulder, and she says, she walks up to me, she taps me on the shoulder. I'm going, "Oh God, I'm busted." She goes, "Who are these people here? Are they supposed to be here?" and luckily, I'd read in Rolling Stone that he had this tour underwritten. So I said, "Oh no, they just won a prize with Lexus. They're supposed to be here." She goes, "Oh, thank you," and she walks away, and I'm going, I'm not supposed to be there. So now about 50 minutes go by, and I've got a camera on my lap. I'm not supposed to. And I'm trying to record my friend rehearsing with Paul McCartney. And she walks by and she taps me on the shoulder. By this time, I'm confident. I goes, "Yes." She taps me on the shoulder and she goes, "Are cameras allowed in the show?" I said, "No, absolutely not." She goes, "Oh, thank you. You've been a godsend." I was like, "Oh my God, how did I get away with this?" And then that night, you and I hooked up and we went to the show. But that was all that day. It was like, what a heady experience that was.
Yeah, wow,
unbelievable. Anyway, so okay, so back to it. So with Jeff Lynne, so you did an album with Jeff Lynne. I wasn't even aware of that.
yeah. It's called Get Up. It was Brian's album 3-4 years ago.
And that's the thing about him, he never stops working. I just went to the show with Brian here in Victoria. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I guess. And of course, and met up with Keith and stuff. And Keith Scott he's just one of the best people on earth. And what a player.
Tasteful player. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
And he's never changed. He's a sweet and kind and generous and like a totally unaffected guy. Yeah. Just he's grateful to be where he is and treats the world accordingly, And
he gives it his all every night, just 200%.
And I said this to Mike Frazee the other day too. I couldn't believe it. Brian went out and closed the show with 4 acoustic numbers, just him and his acoustic guitar, and brought the house down. Yeah, and two of the songs I'd never heard before.
Wow.
Just unbelievable. Like, it's amazing how much command he has now.
Very few people can do that.
Yeah, from the guy that I met at
I know this
at what was it called, Keencraft in Calgary, the music store.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
Just he's tenacious but hugely talented. He just can. He could do a whole and has done a whole show with just him and the guitar.
Yeah. Well, he did a whole tour that way. I remember. Yeah. I remember they did a power trio where he played bass and they dressed all in white. I always thought it was his doing homage to Shama. Yeah. I want to talk about you and Brian doing the Pretty Woman thing on Broadway.
Oh yeah,
because that was an interesting experience. We talked about it a bit, but I want people to know more about the goings on and how all that works when you're writing songs. Now, here's the thing: Pretty Woman. Why wouldn't they use the song Pretty Woman in Pretty Woman on Broadway? It was obviously probably a licensing thing, or they wanted to do something different. Or
they did end up using it. I mean, that's part of a longer story. I'm not sure if we have time. We started off not using it. I think, and I'm not sure if I'm correct on this, I think the Roy Orbison estate obviously thought, okay, Pretty Woman, the musical, they're going to want our dad's song. And I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think they approached the estate and the license fee they wanted was exorbitant. So the producers of the musical decided not to use the Pretty Woman song. But then 2 years later, they went back to the estate. And I think it was a little more agreeable terms by that time. They were like, okay, well, we'll let you have it for much less, having sort of called their bluff first time around. But that said, the director wanted to use all original material. I mean, there's a whole album's worth of material in the film itself, the original Pretty Woman film, and they could have just done what's called a jukebox musical on Broadway, where they just take the songs from the original production and cobble something together around that. But the director and the producer wanted all original material. So I'm not quite sure how Brian got involved.
He's tenacious.
Well, yeah. Actually, there's more to it. It just occurred to me. So Brian, I think 10 years ago, had the idea that Pretty Woman would make a great musical, and he approached somebody at Disney, because Disney have the rights to the film, and they said there are no plans to make a musical from Pretty Woman. So Brian kind of left it. And then years and years later, he was in London talking to a woman he knows who's in the musical. In New York, they call it Broadway, and in London, they call it the West End. He was talking to a woman who works in the West End, and they were talking about musicals, and she said, you should do a musical. And Brian said, well, I tried a few years ago. She said, oh, what was that? He said, well, I tried to get Pretty Woman going. And she said, oh, I heard they're making a musical of it right now. Brian went, what? So he called the original guy back that he had first spoken to 10 years ago, who had no recollection of their original conversation. But the guy said, yeah, we're doing it. And Brian said, well, I'd love to be involved. So it was arranged that Brian and I would meet with the director to audition for the part, basically, or discuss it. So we flew to London and met with the director in a little pizza shop in the West End. And we said to the guy, what's your vision for the musical? Just describe maybe the opening number for us as you see it, which he did, very animated guy. So Brian and I went back home And it took a couple of weeks. At first, I just thought, I'm not sure I can do this. It's not my wheelhouse. But long story short, we came up with the idea for an opening number. Ended up in New York at the guy's apartment. The director played it for him, and he basically hired us on the spot. He said, "I love what you've done." So it was then the beginning of a 3-year marathon of literally almost daily writing, rewriting, stuff being accepted, stuff being rejected, rewriting again. I mean, it was the most work I've ever done on a project ever. It was 3 extremely intense years. Some of it challenging, some of it fun, some of it drudgery, some of it like just you want to just shoot yourself. It's just so frustrating to put your heart into something and then have it thrown out a day later. It was the most work I've ever done, ever.
Do you think that's common with most writers that are doing things for Broadway production, or is it because you guys were fledgling?
Both.
Okay.
I mean, we were fish out of water. This was a first time for us, so we knew nothing about Broadway. So we were on a pretty steep learning curve. But I talked to others who had been doing it for years, and they said, "Yeah, it's normal. Like you write and you rewrite and you rewrite and you rewrite, and then it gets thrown out anyway." And then you start again with another song and you write it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it, and it gets thrown out. But then a week later it's back in. And just, for me, based on how I've worked during the course of my career, you win some, you lose some. You put the same amount of work into every song, and sometimes the song ends up on an album and sometimes it doesn't. You just, take the lumps and move on. But to spend 3 years on I think there was 20 songs in the musical. So to get 20 songs, we wrote at least minimum, we wrote 40 to get 20. And even in that 40, I'm sure we wrote some of those 2 or 3 times. It was an enormous amount of work and not always fun, not always fun.
Who's more exuberant in the writing process or in keeping, because you have to lift yourselves up sometimes when you got that drudgery. Did you were sometimes Bryan was the more up guy, sometimes you were, or was it?
Good. That's a really good question. I think we kind of took turns being despondent. Like whenever I was, I can't do this, Bryan would go, "Come on, let's keep rocking." So we take turns, and whenever Bryan was frustrated, I'd be the one to pick him up. So we kind of tag teamed on that, and there might have been 1 or 2 times over that 3-year period where both of us were down in the dumps, But it was a journey, and we carried each other. We kind of tag teamed on the level of enthusiasm required to get across the finish line.
Now, I know it closed on Broadway. Was it still on the West End when COVID hit?
Yeah, so it had a successful year in New York on Broadway, and then it moved to London, and it was selling out every night when COVID hit, so it closed. It was also in Hamburg, which is, unbeknownst to me, Hamburg is kind of the musical theater capital of Europe.
That's right. That's right. We talked about that on the phone. You told me that, which is amazing because now we're back to the Beatles.
I know. I spent a month in Hamburg and got to know it really well, and of course spent time, touring the Reeperbahn, the area where the Beatles performed, and tried on my own to find location of the Star Club and the Indra and the Top 10 Club and so on, and had parts of success. But then the guitar player for our Pretty Woman orchestra in Hamburg said, we were talking about the Beatles. He said, "Oh, you need to meet my friend Stephanie. She's the sort of world's renowned Beatle expert for Hamburg tours. And she's actually Mark Lewison, when he was writing his Tune In book,
right,
consulted Stephanie on the Hamburg era. So she really knows her stuff. And she was friends with Klaus Wurman and friends with Asbjørn and so on. So anyway, I hooked up with Stephanie, and I mean, just, so sweet. And she kind of took me out for 2 or 3 hours of a Hamburg tour, and she knows all the club owners. So we got into the Top 10 Club and into the Kaiser Keller.
They're all still there.
They're the only one that's not there. So the Beatles played the Indra, Kaiser Keller, Top 10 Club, and the Star Club over a 2-year period from August 1960 till June 62. And June 62 is pretty much when they went in for the first time with George Martin. Pete Best was still on drums then.
Right.
But from that period, August 1960 to June 62, they were pretty much in Hamburg the whole time. And they would go between these 4 clubs. The Star Club burned down a few years ago, so it's no longer there. But and the Indoor Club was closed that day. But Stephanie took me into the Kaiser Keller and the Top 10 Club.
For me being the Beatle freak here, I need to know, like, you and I have played a lot of the same rooms. If you were to compare the sizes of those rooms, like, are they the size of like a say a Club Soda or a Fun Palace in Abbotsford or one of those little clubs I used to play?
Small, more Club Soda size.
Okay.
Yeah, not like, remember Outlaws on Georgia?
Yes.
Not that big.
Yeah, Outlaws was a very big club.
That was huge.
There's like 500 seats or something.
Yeah, these were small clubs, and the Beatles might have played for 50 people, maybe 100 max, maybe.
Really, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. So that's actually smaller than Club Soda, because Club Soda was probably about 250 licensed for.
Yeah, but it was packed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Check out our many other episodes and vignettes for more great content. And please like, share, and subscribe, and become a member at SocialNRGPresents.com to access all our content and earn valuable energy points just for watching.